Olmecs, the first great civilization of the Americas. Secrets of the Colossal Heads. Cold open. A face that shouldn't exist yet. A face stares out of the jungle, calm, heavy-lidded, unmistakably human. The lips are full, the cheeks are broad. A helmet hugs the skull like a crown built for impact. And the problem is, this face is ancient, older than the Maya, older than the Aztec Empire by more than 1,000 years, older than almost everything most people imagine when they picture ancient America. It's a stone head the height of a room, carved from volcanic rock and hauled across rivers and swamps without metal tools, without wheels, without draft animals, then placed like a statement. We are here, and we rule here. But who were we? They left no libraries, no epic poems, no royal chronicles we can read with confidence. What we have are fragments, cities remade from earth, offerings buried like messages to the underworld, and art so powerful it still feels alive. Tonight, we're going into the Olmec world, San Lorenzo, Venta, and beyond, tracking how a civilization rose in the Gulf lowlands, invented new ways to show power, and shaped the blueprint of Mesoamerica. And by the end, the colossal heads won't feel like a random mystery anymore. They'll feel like the final frame of a story that begins with water, mud, maze, and a landscape that can swallow whole cities. Intro. Channel framing plus what we'll cover. Welcome back. This is a deep history documentary, slow burn, evidence-based, and honest about what we know versus what we think we know. Because the Olmecs sit at a strange crossroads, they're famous, giant heads, jade masks, jaguar imagery, but they're also misunderstood. They're often called the first great civilization of Mesoamerica, yet archaeologists still debate what that really means. So here's our path today. 1. Where the Olmecs lived and why this landscape made them possible. 2. San Lorenzo, the early powerhouse engineered from earth and stone. 3. Venta, the ceremonial city of offerings, mosaics, and sacred geometry. 4. The colossal heads, what they are, how they were moved, and what they meant. 5. Olmec art and belief, jaguars, maze, masks, and the supernatural. 6. Ritual places like El Manatee, where offerings sank into a living bog. 7. Influence and debate, mother culture versus sister cultures. 8. Writing and time, from the Cascajal block to later scripts in the region. 9. Decline and legacy, what ended, what transformed, and what survived. If you like your history with atmosphere and receipts, you're in the right place. Chapter 1. Rubber Country and the Problem of Names. Let's start with the word Olmec, because it's not what most people assume. Olmec is a name from the Nahuatl language associated with later peoples in central Mexico, and it's often translated as something like people of the rubber country, tied to the Gulf lowlands where rubber trees grow. The twist is that the historic Olmecs in Nahuatl sources weren't the same as the much older civilization archaeologists are talking about. So why keep the name? Because when modern archaeology began piecing together this early Gulf Coast culture through art styles, monuments, and shared iconography, the label stuck. It became a convenient tag for a civilization that flourished roughly from about 1200 to 400 BCE, long before the famous classic Maya cities. But Olmec is still a shortcut, a modern category for something ancient and complex. Now, about the rubber. We know the Gulf region was rich in latex-producing trees. Rubber objects appear in the archaeological record, and later Mesoamerican societies famously played ball games using rubber balls. For the Olmec world, rubber isn't just a material, it's a clue. It implies chemical knowledge, specialized production, and ritual life, because in Mesoamerica, the ball game becomes far more than sport. It becomes cosmology in motion. But even here, archaeology keeps us humble. Modern scientific studies of specific ancient rubber balls, like those found at El Manatí, can complicate older explanations of how rubber was processed. The big takeaway isn't one perfect recipe. It's that these people were experimenting with a demanding material very early on. So when we say Olmec, we're really pointing to a civilization we meet through its fingerprints, earthworks, stone monuments, offerings, and a visual language that travels far beyond the swamps where it was born. Chapter 2: The Olmec Heartland, a civilization built on water. If you want to understand the Olmecs, don't start with a temple. Start with water. The Gulf lowlands of what is now Veracruz and Tabasco are humid, river-laced, and fertile, but they're also unstable. Rivers shift, floodplains expand and contract, swamps hide sinkholes and bogs. In some seasons, the land feels like it's dissolving. That's not a disadvantage, it's an engine. Because the same environment that makes travel difficult also makes agriculture powerful, especially when you begin organizing labor at scale. Maize becomes a foundation. Fish, shellfish, turtles, and coastal resources add protein and resilience. River routes become highways for trade, not roads of stone, but corridors of current. Now imagine what it means to create a political center here. You're not just building houses. You're controlling dry ground. You're reshaping terrain. You're deciding who gets the safe fields, who gets the raised platforms, who gets to stand above the flood. This is where early Mesoamerican city doesn't necessarily mean a dense urban grid the way we picture Rome. It can mean something else, a monumental landscape, platforms, mounds, plazas, built to stage power, ritual, and authority. And in the Olmec heartland, the landscape itself becomes part of the message. We can command mud. We can command water. We can command people. That's the background. Now we go to the place where this becomes undeniable. Chapter 3: San Lorenzo, the first power center. San Lorenzo is where the Olmecs step into the spotlight. It's often described as the oldest known major Olmec center, rising early and showing an unexpected level of complexity for its time. It's not just that it has monuments. Lots of places have monuments. It's that San Lorenzo looks like a society that can mobilize labor, plan space, and sustain elite power. The site sits on a plateau above surrounding plains, and archaeology suggests major human reshaping of the landscape: mounds, ridges, built-up terrain, and an overall layout that reads like a controlled civic ceremonial core rather than a random sprawl. Now, picture what this means in practice. If you can redesign a plateau, move earth, cut into ravines, create controlled spaces, you can also redesign society. Because every construction project is a census in motion. It's food logistics, it's supervision, it's hierarchy made visible. San Lorenzo also gives us some of the most iconic Olmec stonework. Monumental sculptures carved from basalt and hauled from volcanic regions. Think about the supply chain. Quarrying heavy stone without metal tools, moving it over distance, using rivers as transport routes, coordinating labor teams, and then, after all that, carving faces with personality. And then there's something darker. Evidence that many monuments were deliberately damaged and buried around the time San Lorenzo declines. That hints at conflict, political overthrow, internal revolt, invasion, or ritual decommissioning of power. The truth is, we don't get a clear fall of the capital story. We get a pattern of destruction and transition. San Lorenzo's dominance fades, and another center rises to become the ceremonial heart of the Olmec world. That place is Venta. Chapter 4. Venta, a ceremonial city of offerings. Venta feels different. If San Lorenzo is raw political muscle, Venta is stagecraft, ritual architecture, planned alignment, and offerings on a scale that suggests a civilization speaking to gods as much as to people. Venta sits in coastal wetlands, an island environment rich in farming and marine resources. It grows into a major center after San Lorenzo's decline, reaching peak importance for centuries. And then there's the layout: a north-south axis, ceremonial complexes, and a great pyramid, one of the earliest large pyramidal structures in the region. Imagine standing on flat wetland terrain and seeing a massive earthen rise dominating the horizon. Even today, the shape carries presence. Now go north of that pyramid into the area archaeologists call Complex A. This is where Venta becomes unforgettable. Complex A contained buried offerings, greenstone deposits, mosaics made of carefully arranged serpentine blocks, and elite-controlled spaces marked by basalt columns, like a fence or sacred boundary. Some of the most dramatic finds are caches that were never meant to be seen again once buried, art created for the gods, sealed under layers of earth. One of the most haunting examples is Offering 4, a group of small stone figures arranged in a deliberate scene placed in the ground as if freezing a ritual moment. 17 figures, a row of upright jade celts, a composition that still feels like a story, except we don't have the script. This is the power of Venta. It's not only monumental, It's intentional. It's a city that treats burial as communication, placing wealth, labor, and meaning into the earth, like sending messages into the deep time of the underworld. Chapter 5. The Colossal Heads, Portraits of Power. Now we face the icons, the colossal heads. Archaeologists have recovered multiple colossal heads from the major Olmec centers, San Lorenzo, Venta, and Tres Zapotes. They vary in size, but the effect is always the same: a human face turned into a monument. The first question people ask is, are they gods? But the heads are so individual, so portrait-like, that many researchers interpret them as rulers or elite figures. They wear helmet-like headgear, and their expressions are distinct, some stern, some almost weary, some set with quiet authority. Then comes the bigger question. How? Basalt is heavy. Transport is brutal. Yet these heads were carved with stone tools, pounding, pecking, grinding, and moved across a landscape that actively fights logistics. One plausible solution is water, rivers and rafts, seasonal planning, human labor in disciplined coordination. The work itself becomes a political technology. If you can organize the movement of a multi-ton boulder, you can organize almost anything. So what did a colossal head do in society? Think of it like a broadcast tower built from stone. It says, "This person matters enough to be immortalized. This community has the power to move mountains. This place is not just land. It is a center of gravity." And there's another layer. These heads are not only art, they're memory. In a world without written dynastic history, we can easily read, a giant face is a kind of record, public, undeniable, and enduring. Even when later centuries eroded the features, the message remained. Someone once had the authority to command this much labor for a single image. Chapter 6. Jade, Masks, and the Supernatural Face of Olmec Art. If the colossal heads are the public face of power, jade and greenstone are the private language of the elite. Olmec artists mastered greenstone sculpture, polished surfaces, lifelike softness carved out of stubborn material. Masks and faces appear again and again, but they're not always fully human. Some look like they're mid-transformation, caught between worlds. And this is where the Olmecs become deeply Mesoamerican in a way later cultures will recognize. Art isn't decoration, it's cosmology. Certain recurring features, downturned mouths, almond-shaped eyes, cleft heads, show up in supernatural imagery. You see them on celts, masks, small figures. This doesn't tell us the Olmec religion like a textbook, but it suggests a symbolic system where maize, fertility, rain, animals, and human authority are fused. One way to think of it is shamanic transformation, not magic as fantasy, more like a worldview where rulers and ritual specialists mediate between realms. The jaguar, powerful, nocturnal, moving between forest and shadow, becomes a perfect symbol for crossing boundaries. Another key is that greenstone itself carries meaning. Its color echoes young maize and vegetation. A polished green celt can be more than a tool-shaped object. It can be a metaphor of sprouting life, a condensed symbol of growth. And remember Venta. So many of these objects were buried, hidden, removed from human eyes, which implies their true audience wasn't the public. It was the earth, the ancestors, the gods. Olmec art is often described as mysterious, but it's also consistent in its logic. The face is where humanity meets the supernatural, and whoever controls that boundary controls the story of the world. Chapter 7. El Manatí, a bog that kept the evidence. Now we go to a place that feels like a myth, except it's real. El Manatí is a site where offerings were placed into a wet, oxygen-poor environment, conditions that can preserve organic materials that normally vanish. And what was found there is astonishing. Ancient wooden objects, rubber balls, and other ritual deposits. This matters because wood usually decays, textiles decay. Even evidence of everyday ritual disappears. But here, the environment held on to it, like the earth refused to let the story be erased. INA reports describe ancient rubber balls discovered in the late 1980s at the foot of Cerro El Manatí, along with other ritual materials. The balls vary in size and weight, and scientific analysis points to rubber derived from Castilla elastica. So what was El Manatí? Think of it as a sacred interface between worlds. The mountain, the watery bog, and the human community offering something valuable into a place where it can't be retrieved. This kind of ritual isn't throwing objects away. It's investing. It's paying a debt to forces that control rain, harvest, health, fertility, and political legitimacy. Because in early complex societies, rulers don't just govern people. They govern uncertainty. And nothing is more uncertain than a floodplain civilization living at the mercy of water. El Manatí shows us the Olmecs weren't only builders of public monuments. They were also builders of sacred practice, repeatable, structured, and expensive enough to require organized authority. In a way, a bog offering is the opposite of a colossal head. A head shouts, "Look at me." A bog offering whispers, "Remember us, even when no one is watching." Chapter 8. Influence. Mother culture, or one great civilization among many? Here's where Olmec history turns into a debate, and it's one of the most important debates in all of ancient American archaeology. For decades, the Olmecs were often described as the mother culture of Mesoamerica, the first major civilization to develop key patterns that later societies adopted: monumental art, ceremonial centers, elite iconography, and shared religious themes. There's evidence that Olmec-style imagery and objects appear far beyond the Gulf lowlands, sometimes hundreds of kilometers away. That suggests trade, influence, imitation, and possibly elite networks reaching across regions. But another viewpoint argues for something more nuanced. Instead of one mother, think of multiple peer societies evolving in interaction, exchanging ideas, competing, borrowing, innovating in parallel. In that model, the Olmecs are still extraordinary, but they're part of a broader, early formative world that's more connected and more competitive than a simple one-way story. So what's the honest takeaway? The Olmecs clearly built an early, powerful tradition that traveled, and later Mesoamerica clearly looks like it inherits some broad patterns consistent with Olmec precedent. But influence doesn't have to mean everything started here. History is rarely a single origin point. More often, it's a network. One region becomes a loudspeaker for styles and ideologies that others adapt for their own purposes. So I like to frame it this way. The Olmecs didn't invent Mesoamerica alone, but they helped define what Mesoamerican power looked like, and that visual language became useful to rising elites across many regions. In other words, the Olmecs were a prototype of civilization as performance, and everyone was watching. Chapter 9. Writing, Symbols, and the Problem of Decipherment. Did the Olmecs have writing? The safest answer is, we have evidence of early symbols and at least one famous candidate for early writing, plus later scripts in the same broader region that may or may not connect cleanly. The headline object is the Cuscahal block, associated with the Olmec world and dated roughly to around 1000 to 800 BCE in published discussions. It shows incised signs arranged in lines, suggesting something more systematic than casual decoration. If that dating and association hold, it would make Cuscahal among the earliest writing candidates in Mesoamerica and possibly the Western Hemisphere. But scholars debate. The corpus is small, context matters, and "this is writing" is a high bar. Writing should reliably encode language, not just imagery. Then we move forward in time into what's often called epi-Olmec contexts around the Isthmus of Tehuantepec and the Gulf lowlands, where longer inscriptions appear on monuments like La Mohara Stela I, and long count dates show up at sites like Tres Zapotes. Here, the story gets even more complex. Decipherment attempts exist, but they're contested. Some researchers argue for progress. Others argue the evidence isn't sufficient for confident reading yet. This isn't failure. It's science doing what science does in hard cases, demanding repeatability, testing, and caution. The deeper point is this. Even if we can't read an Olmec history book, the push toward symbolic recording, names, dates, events, becomes a defining trajectory in Mesoamerica. And the Olmec world sits early on that trajectory, not as a completed chapter we can quote, but as the moment the pen begins to hover over the page. Chapter 10. Decline, Transformation, and What the Olmecs Became. So what happened? Why do the great centers fade? We know that by around the end of the Olmec period, major heartland centers were abandoned or transformed. Venta's prominence ends, and the classic Olmec center pattern changes. But archaeology rarely gives us a single villain. Possible pressures include environmental shifts in river systems and wetlands, internal political conflict, competition among centers, changing trade networks, and social transformation, people reorganizing rather than vanishing. And that last point matters. Civilizations don't always die like a candle blown out. Sometimes they change shape, like a river dividing into new channels. In the Gulf lowlands and nearby regions, later cultures continue to build, carve, and record. Sites like Tres Zapotes persist beyond the peak of Venta. New identities and languages dominate later centuries, but the older Olmec visual language, faces, masks, jaguar power, elite display, echoes forward. So the Olmecs aren't just an origin story. They're a demonstration of a human pattern that repeats across time. When societies grow complex, they invent ways to make power visible. They build monuments that outlast leaders. They bury offerings that outlast memory. They create art that keeps talking even after the language changes. And that's why the colossal heads still feel so present. They were built to be present. They were made to say, "We were here." And even now, across thousands of years, they succeed. What to remember? If you remember one thing, remember this. The Olmecs were not a footnote before the Maya. They were a civilization of engineers and artists, of planned ceremonial landscapes, of political imagination strong enough to organize people across swamps and rivers to carve faces into mountains. Their story survives without a neat written history because their medium was heavier than paper. Earth, stone, greenstone, and ritual deposits placed where time itself becomes the archive. In the next episode, we can go deeper into one of two directions. Your call. The Mesoamerican ball game and its earliest archaeological shadows, or a full tour of Venta's offerings and what they might represent. If you want that, leave a comment with which path you'd pick, and I'll build the next documentary around it. Until then, keep your eyes on the ancient world. It's still watching us back.